The summer had just begun in the mountain community where my cabin stood, a small retreat that I had built up over years of effort, saving, and countless weekends of manual labor. I had chosen this place for its solitude, its natural beauty, and its distance from the constant surveillance of city life. For me, the cabin wasn't just a property. It was the manifestation of independence, a place where my values and work ethic stood carved into the walls and foundation. I wanted space, quiet, and freedom, and for a while, that's exactly what I had. The community around me was a mixture of longtime residents and newer arrivals who had been drawn to the postcard-perfect scenery. With that combination came the creation of a homeowners association, something I had never wanted to be part of. Unfortunately, the cabin technically fell within the boundaries of their jurisdiction. At first, I thought nothing of it. How much trouble could they cause a person who simply wanted to live peacefully in the mountains? But as anyone who has lived under the rule of a micromanaging HOA knows, trouble often comes not in large battles but in small, suffocating intrusions. The first hints arrived quietly. Notices tucked under my door about community beautification projects. Reminders that all cabins should have uniform paint colors to maintain property values. Strongly worded letters about the type of fencing allowed. I had ignored them. My cabin was mine, and the HOA's rules seemed petty compared to the freedom of owning one's land. Yet, each time I ignored a notice, the tone of the next became sharper, more insistent. By late spring, I began to sense that the HOA board had shifted its focus more heavily toward me. It wasn't just the notices anymore. I noticed unfamiliar. Cars slowing down in front of my cabin, board members whispering to each other at the monthly gatherings in town, and neighbors giving me that pitying look that often comes before gossip takes root. Something was brewing, and I was about to find out exactly what it was. One morning, as I sat on the porch drinking coffee and looking out at the ridgeline where the sun spilled gold across the pines, I noticed movement near the base of my property. A woman in a purple blazer, clipboard in hand, was walking along the edge of my driveway, speaking animatedly to a man in a suit. Behind them, I saw another man with a camera taking pictures of the exterior of my cabin. Confused, I set my mug down and walked toward them, but by the time I reached the gate, they were gone, driven off in a sleek car that looked completely out of place on the gravel road. Later that day, I discovered the shocking reality. A large, bold "For Sale" sign had been posted at the entrance of my property, nailed crudely into the dirt beside the road. I yanked it out and tossed it aside, furious but not yet fully understanding. A neighbor, hesitant but sympathetic, later confirmed what I feared. The HOA had been in talks with a local realtor about repositioning certain properties in the community. My cabin had somehow been listed without my consent, as though the HOA had decided it no longer belonged to me. The rage that surged through me was unlike anything I had ever felt. To have strangers walk my land as though they were potential buyers, to see my sanctuary treated like a commodity for the board's games, it was an insult not just to me but to every hour I had spent building and protecting the place. That night, I sat at the kitchen table under the warm glow of a single lamp and thought about my options. Most people, I suspected, would have tried to fight this through paperwork, lawyers, and endless meetings. But I knew that approach would only lead to more frustration and wasted time. The HOA thrived on bureaucracy. They wanted me tangled in their web of rules and fine print. I needed a response that was clear, immediate, and impossible for them to ignore. The next morning, I drove into town and bought a heavy-duty chain and padlock. I also picked up a large piece of plywood and paint supplies. Back at the cabin, I secured the front gate with the chain, ensuring no unwanted cars could enter without my say. Then I painted my own sign, bold black letters on a white background, "Private property, not for sale." I mounted it where the HOA's Realtor sign had stood, making sure it was visible from the road. For a moment, I felt a wave of satisfaction. I had taken control. The message was clear. My cabin was mine, and no board, no realtor, no neighborly gossip could change that. But even as the paint dried, I knew this was only the beginning. The HOA would see my act not as a defense of property rights, but as a challenge to their authority. They thrived on control, and I had just taken that control away from them. Sure, enough. Within 2 days, the retaliation began. I noticed new notices shoved into my mailbox, this time citing unauthorized signage and gated obstruction. They demanded I remove the lock and the sign immediately or face escalating fines. When I ignored the notice, a second arrived, this one threatening legal action and community intervention. I wasn't the only one who had noticed the escalation. Neighbors stopped me on the street, some whispering their support, others warning me that the HOA board didn't take kindly to defiance. One older couple admitted they had seen the realtor touring my property before I had locked the gate, but they were too afraid to speak up. The fear that hung over the community was palpable. People complied with the HOA not because they agreed, but because resistance seemed impossible. And that, I realized, was why my fight mattered more than I had first thought. This wasn't just about my cabin anymore. It was about standing against a system that believed it could strip people of their independence under the guise of community improvement. My gate and my sign were more than barriers. They were symbols that someone was willing to say no. Still, I knew symbols alone wouldn't be enough. The HOA board would be planning their next move, and if I wanted to stay ahead, I needed to be ready. I started documenting everything, every notice, every sign, every car that slowed down in front of my cabin. I took photographs, logged dates, and made copies. If they wanted a fight, I would give them one, but it would be on my terms. What I didn't realize at that moment was just how far the HOA was willing to go. For them, my defiance wasn't simply inconvenient. It was dangerous. It threatened the illusion of control they had built over the community. And for people who thrived on power, nothing was more dangerous than a precedent of resistance. So while I locked my gate and watched the mountains from my porch, feeling a fragile sense of security, the board was already plotting their counterattack. And when it came, it wouldn't just test my patience or my temper. It would test how far I was willing to go to protect the one place in the world that truly belonged to me. The following week dawned crisp and clear, but the peace of the morning was immediately broken by the sound of an engine slowing at the foot of my driveway. From the porch, I could see a vehicle that didn't belong, sleek, polished, out of place among the pickup trucks and mud-splattered SUVs that usually traveled the mountain road. A woman in the same purple blazer I had noticed before stepped out, accompanied by 2 men. She carried a file folder under her arm and moved with the confidence of someone who believed the ground beneath her belonged to her authority. I stayed where I was, arms folded, watching. When she reached the locked gate, she rattled the chain, then gestured toward my homemade sign. From the movement of her lips and her dramatic hand motions, I could tell she was outraged. One of the men, likely another board member, scribbled something onto a clipboard. The other held up a phone and appeared to be recording. They stood there for nearly 10 minutes, pointing at my gate, pointing at my cabin, and taking notes before leaving in a puff of dust. That was their opening shot. By that afternoon, a certified letter arrived in my mailbox. It was longer and more aggressive than the earlier notices. This one accused me of defacing community harmony, of engaging in unlawful obstruction of community oversight, and of damaging the aesthetic consistency of the neighborhood. It threatened escalating fines for each day the gate remained locked and the sign displayed. It also included an ominous line about the HOA, reserving the right to pursue transfer of deed under community bylaws if non-compliance continued. I sat at my kitchen table with the letter spread before me. The words burned like acid. Transfer of deed? As though they could take what I owned because I refused to let them trespass? The arrogance of it was staggering. But I also knew this was not an empty threat. HOAs had armies of lawyers and reams of convoluted bylaws written precisely to scare homeowners into submission. Most people folded under the weight of the paperwork before ever testing the limits of those threats. I wasn't most people. That evening, I reinforced my gate with heavier locks and added a second sign. Trespassers will be recorded. I mounted an old trail camera onto a nearby tree, angling it toward the road. If they wanted to play intimidation games, I would meet them with documentation and deterrence. Over the next several days, the board escalated its tactics. More vehicles came to linger at the end of my drive, idling for long stretches as if to prove they could. Strangers appeared in the neighborhood, knocking on doors and asking questions about me. Rumors spread that my property was in foreclosure, or soon to be auctioned. I caught whispers in town about a troubled homeowner who might be forced out. It was clear the HOA wanted to turn public opinion against me before the fight became official. But what they underestimated was the resilience of people who had quietly suffered under their thumb for years. Several neighbors began stopping by. My porch, not openly but under the guise of casual visits. They shared their own stories of being fined for trivial infractions, a garden gnome in the wrong place, a flower bed that wasn't uniform in color, a fence 2 inches higher than regulations allowed. Many admitted they supported my stand, though few had the courage to do so publicly. The fear of retaliation was that strong. One neighbor in particular, an older man named Dennis, confided something that shifted the entire battle in my mind. He told me that years earlier, another homeowner had resisted the HOA's control. That man, too, had received notices and threats. Eventually, his cabin had been foreclosed on and sold under murky legal circumstances. The board claimed unpaid. Dues and mounting fines had justified the action, but Dennis swore the man had been targeted simply because he refused to bow. "They'll push you until you break," Dennis warned quietly, "or until they take what's yours." His words didn't scare me the way he intended. Instead, they hardened my resolve. If the HOA had bullied others into silence before, then my fight wasn't just personal. It was about proving that their power could be resisted. The very next week, the HOA moved to escalate the conflict officially. Another letter arrived, this one notifying me of a mandatory compliance hearing to be held at the community center. Failure to appear, it said, would result in immediate fines and possible legal referral. The hearing was scheduled for Friday evening, a time deliberately chosen to maximize public attention. I knew exactly what they intended. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted me standing alone in front of the board, accused of violating their bylaws while the rest of the community watched silently from folding chairs. They wanted to break me publicly, to strip away my defiance under the bright fluorescent lights of their sterile meeting room. So I made my own plan. On the day of the hearing, I gathered every piece of documentation I had collected. Photos of the realtor on my property, copies of the "for sale" signs I had torn down, every notice and letter they had shoved in my mailbox. I put them in a binder, neatly labeled and tabbed. I dressed plainly but firmly, not in defiance, but in quiet confidence. When I walked into that community center, I didn't look like a rebel. They would expect that. I looked like a man who had done his homework. The room was packed. Word of the confrontation had spread, and nearly every homeowner was present. At the front of the room sat the board members, stiff and severe in their chairs, their expressions smug with anticipation. The woman in the purple blazer presided at the center like a judge preparing to issue a sentence. When my name was called, I stepped forward, binder in hand, and stood before them. They began with their accusations: unauthorized signage, obstruction of community oversight, refusal to comply with uniformity bylaws. They recited the list as though reading from scripture, voices sharp and clipped. The audience sat silent, the tension so thick it could have been cut with a knife. And then, when they asked if I had a response, I opened my binder. Calmly, steadily, I laid out each piece of evidence. Photos of their realtor trespassing, copies of the for sale sign they had placed. Letters threatening actions far beyond their authority. I read aloud from sections of the bylaws that contradicted their claims, pointing out how they had overstepped their own rules. Each page I turned was a small victory, a crack in their carefully crafted facade of control. Murmurs spread through the crowd. I could feel the shift in the room, neighbors realizing that maybe, just maybe, the board wasn't as untouchable as it pretended to be. For the first time, the woman in purple faltered. Her voice wavered as she tried to reassert authority, but the damage was done. Their intimidation wasn't working. When the hearing concluded, they announced that a decision would be issued by mail. Their tone was stiff, clipped, and defensive. They hadn't expected resistance backed by evidence. They hadn't expected me to use their own rules against them. I walked out of that room not just with my dignity intact, but with something more powerful, the sense that the board was no longer untouchable. I had forced them onto the defensive, and the community had witnessed it. But as I returned to my cabin that night, binder still in hand, I knew the battle was only beginning. The HOA had been embarrassed, and people like that rarely forgive humiliation. They would strike back harder, in ways I might not see coming. The game had shifted from notices and signs to something deeper, something far more dangerous, and I had no choice but to be ready. In the days following the compliance hearing, a strange quiet fell over the community. The HOA board had not yet issued their decision, but their silence felt less like retreat and more like the gathering of a storm. I had embarrassed them, in front of the homeowners, exposed their overreach, and shaken the image of authority they had cultivated. People who thrived on power did not forgive such public wounds. I knew their response was coming. What I didn't know was how far they were willing to go. The first signs were subtle. My mailbox, usually filled with only routine deliveries, began to overflow with reminders of late dues and fines that had never existed before. I logged each one carefully, adding them to my growing binder. Then came the rumors. I overheard whispers in town suggesting I was behind on taxes, that I was secretly planning to abandon my cabin, that I was hostile toward neighbors who only wanted a better community. The stories spread fast, crafted not to confront me directly, but to erode my credibility little by little. Soon, petty vandalism began. I found tire tracks across the edge of my property where someone had deliberately spun out in the dirt. One morning, I discovered that my mailbox had been struck, bent awkwardly as though hit by a bat or a car door. Another evening, I came home to find trash bags dumped in my driveway. These weren't coincidences. They were warnings, anonymous acts meant to remind me that the board had long arms and could strike even in the shadows. Despite the escalation, I refused to back down. I reinforced my mailbox with a steel post sunk deep into the ground, replaced my locks with heavier versions, and mounted additional cameras around the perimeter of my cabin. If they wanted to harass me, then at least I would capture every incident. Each act of vandalism became another page in my documentation, evidence of harassment that I carefully preserved. But the HOA wasn't content with petty intimidation. Their true retaliation came in the form of legal pressure. 2 weeks after the hearing, I received a thick envelope by certified mail. Inside was a formal complaint, citing dozens of supposed violations ranging from failure to maintain uniform exterior colors to unauthorized modifications of property access. The language was dense, technical, and deliberately overwhelming. Attached was a threat of legal action demanding that I either comply with all regulations or face foreclosure proceedings. I spent hours poring over the document, my frustration mounting with every page. Most of the claims were absurd, fabricated, violations meant to drown me in bureaucracy. But one section stood out, more sinister than the rest. They claimed that my cabin, being locked and gated, constituted a fire hazard because emergency vehicles could not gain immediate access. It was a clever twist, framing my defense of property rights as a risk to the entire community. It was also a direct attempt to bring outside authorities into the fight. I realized then that the board was not merely trying to pressure me. They were trying to build a case strong enough to force intervention from law enforcement or the courts. If they succeeded, my stand could end not with quiet defiance, but with armed deputies and legal orders tearing down my gate. The weight of the battle pressed heavily on me. There were nights I sat alone at the kitchen table, binder open, wondering if I had the strength to keep fighting. The cabin that had once been a refuge now felt like a fortress under siege. I thought of neighbors who had warned me, who had whispered their support but refused to stand openly. It was easy to see why. Resistance was exhausting, isolating, and dangerous. But every time doubt crept in, I looked at the walls of my cabin, the logs I had stacked with my own hands, the beams I had carried and hammered into place, the sweat and blisters and years of effort it had taken to make this place mine. To surrender now would mean surrendering everything it stood for. And so, despite the fear, I doubled down. When the board's official decision finally arrived, it was exactly what I had expected. A list of fines totaling thousands of dollars, an order to remove my gate and signage within 30 days, and a warning that failure to comply would result in legal foreclosure. It was the nuclear option, the clearest sign that they were determined to break me. But something unexpected happened in the wake of that letter. Neighbors began to speak, more openly. A few came to me directly, offering quiet words of encouragement. One woman, tired of her own battles with the HOA, slipped a manila envelope into my hands containing copies of board meeting notes she had secretly kept. In those notes were discussions about repurposing properties, about recruiting developers, and about removing obstacles to their long-term vision for the community. My cabin wasn't just an annoyance to them. It was standing in the way of a plan, one that likely involved selling parcels of land to outside investors. Suddenly, everything made sense. The Realtor tours, the mysterious for sale signs, the aggressive push to label me non-compliant. It wasn't about beautification or harmony. It was about money and power. My land was valuable to them, and my refusal to sell or submit was the obstacle they needed to eliminate. Armed with this new knowledge, my determination solidified. I wasn't just defending my home anymore. I was exposing corruption. If the board wanted to bring the fight into the legal system, then I would be ready with documentation, evidence, and witnesses. Their threats would not break me. They would backfire. I began reaching out quietly to other homeowners, sharing what I had learned. At first, most were cautious, afraid of retaliation. But slowly, the tide began to shift. Stories emerged of hidden fines, of board members using HOA funds for personal expenses, of favoritism in enforcement. My stand had lit a spark, and that spark was beginning to catch. Still, I knew the board wouldn't go down quietly. People who built their lives on control and intimidation rarely surrendered without a fight. They would escalate further, and the next stage of this battle would be even more dangerous. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, I sat on my porch with the binder in my lap. The wind rustled the pines, carrying with it the faint sound of voices from down the road. Neighbors gathering, whispering, plotting. Whether for me or against me, I could not yet tell. I knew one thing for certain. The fight had grown beyond my gate, beyond my sign. The entire community was watching now, and the next move from the HOA would determine not just my fate, but the future of everyone who lived under their shadow. And that move, I sensed, was already on its way. The first time I saw the flashing lights at the bottom of my driveway, I knew the HOA had escalated beyond rumors and paperwork. The sun had barely set, and the cabin was wrapped in the familiar stillness of evening, when the sharp glow of red and blue pierced the trees. I stepped onto the porch and watched as a patrol car idled at the gate, its headlights cutting across the private property sign I had painted weeks earlier. 2 officers stepped out, their silhouettes outlined against the fading light. They didn't come up immediately. Instead, they stood near the gate, shining flashlights at the lock and rattling the chain the way the board members had done. One spoke into his radio. The other scanned the property as though expecting to catch someone lurking in the shadows. My trail camera blinked faintly from the tree, capturing every second. I waited, forcing calm into my breathing. This was the move the board had been building toward, invoking authority, trying to frame me not as a homeowner defending his land, but as a problem in need of enforcement. Finally, one of the officers called out. His tone was practiced, neutral, but I could hear the faint undercurrent of irritation. He explained that they had received a complaint from the HOA about a locked obstruction and a possible fire hazard. They needed to verify that emergency services could access the property if needed. It was a clever angle, just as I had suspected. The HOA knew that appealing to property values and bylaws wouldn't hold up in court, so they had turned to public safety. Who could argue against the need for fire trucks or ambulances to reach a cabin in an emergency? It was the kind of narrative that made me look selfish, even reckless, unless I had proof of my side of the story. I retrieved my binder. When I approached the gate, I didn't unlock it. Instead, I held up the documentation through the bars of the iron fencing, showing the officers photos of the Realtor trespassing, letters from the HOA, and copies of county regulations. I explained that my gate was not illegal, that access for emergencies was still possible through the wide shoulder by the road, and that the HOA had been fabricating violations in order to pressure me into surrendering my property. The officers listened, flipping through a few pages before handing them back. Their body language softened slightly. They weren't there to arrest anyone. They were there to check a box. After a brief discussion, they noted that as long as the gate was not permanently obstructive and could be opened with keys or cutters in an emergency, they had no grounds to cite me. They left with a polite nod, though one officer warned that these HOA disputes can get ugly. I stood there long after their taillights faded, relief washing over me in waves. I had dodged their first attempt at involving outside authorities, but I knew it wouldn't be their last. If anything, this failure would only enrage the board further. Sure enough, the very next day, a different kind of visitor arrived. A white SUV with the logo of a local realty company pulled up, and out stepped a sharply dressed man carrying glossy brochures. He walked confidently toward the gate, ignoring the signs as though they were invisible. When I called down from the porch, he announced himself cheerfully, explaining that he was there to conduct a scheduled showing of the property. Blood boiled. Scheduled by whom? Not me. The HOA had clearly doubled down, now trying to sell the illusion that my cabin was already on the market. The realtor insisted that potential buyers were waiting and that he had been given permission by the community board. I laughed bitterly, then pointed at the sign, "Not for sale." I told him in no uncertain terms that he was trespassing, and that any further attempt to enter would be documented and reported. He tried charm, then persistence, then thinly veiled irritation, but when I held up my phone to record him, his demeanor changed instantly. He retreated to his SUV, muttering under his breath as he drove away. For the rest of that week, a parade of unfamiliar cars slowed down at the end of my drive. Some turned back immediately, others lingered, peering through the trees as though expecting an open house. The HOA was manufacturing the illusion of a sale, attempting to make it seem inevitable. If they couldn't legally force me out, they would socially and psychologically pressure me until I broke. But instead of breaking, I grew sharper. Every incident was documented. Every unwanted visitor, every car, every attempt at intimidation went into the binder. And now, thanks to a few brave neighbors, I had more than just my own evidence. Whispered stories reached me of board members, holding closed-door meetings with developers, discussing ways to rebrand the community into a luxury retreat. My cabin, with its hand-built charm and refusal to conform, didn't fit the glossy vision they were selling. One evening, Dennis returned with news that chilled me. He had overheard a conversation between two board members at the town cafe. They were frustrated that the police visit had failed, but confident that the next step, an injunction through county court, would succeed. If he won't move. Dennis quoted them, "We'll move him." That night, I barely slept. The cabin felt less like a home and more like a bunker. I kept lights on, cameras recording, and the binder close at hand. I knew the storm was about to break fully. Days later, it did. A process server arrived with official paperwork. The HOA had filed a lawsuit seeking to impose fines, force the removal of my gate, and compel compliance with their rules. Attached was a demand for thousands in back dues and penalties, inflated with interest and fees. They wanted to bury me under debt, to make the cost of resistance greater than the value of victory. I sat at the table once more, papers spread out before me, the weight of the battle pressing heavily on my shoulders. This was no longer a skirmish, it was a war. One that would drain time, money, and energy in endless waves. But as I looked at the cabin around me, the wood I had cut, the stone I had laid, the view I had chosen, I knew one truth with absolute clarity. I would not let them win. Not through lies, not through intimidation, not through legal trickery. I had something stronger than their greed. I had resolve. And if they wanted a war, then I would give them one. The flashing lights of that first patrol car had been their opening move. The lawsuit in my hands was their escalation. But the board had underestimated one thing. Every time they tried to break me, they only hardened my will. The morning of the hearing was gray and heavy, as though the sky itself understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. I drove down the winding mountain road toward the county courthouse, the binder of evidence resting on the passenger seat, like both a shield and a weight. I had spent weeks preparing, cataloging every letter, every photograph, every recording. This was not just a defense. It was an indictment of everything the HOA had done. When I arrived, the parking lot was already filling. The HOA board members clustered together in their tailored clothes, exuding smug confidence. They looked like they were about to close a real estate deal, not confront a homeowner in court. At their center, as always, was the woman in the purple blazer. She carried herself like royalty, her chin high, her lips curled in the faint smile of someone who believed victory was already assured. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. On one side sat the board, flanked by their attorney, a sharp-featured man with a briefcase full of paperwork. On the other side sat me, alone but steady, my binder open and ready. The gallery filled quickly with curious neighbors, some whispering in support, others watching silently, afraid to reveal their loyalties. The case began with the HOA's attorney rattling off their accusations: unpaid dues, unauthorized signage, obstruction of emergency access, violation of aesthetic standards. His tone was rehearsed, practiced, the kind of speech designed to overwhelm with authority. He painted me as a rogue homeowner, endangering the harmony and safety of the community. Each word was carefully chosen to frame the board as protectors, and me as a reckless obstacle. When it was my turn, I rose slowly, binder in hand. My voice was calm, not loud, not defensive. I began with the simplest evidence: photographs of the unauthorized Realtor tour, copies of the for sale signs. I had removed timestamps showing the board's direct involvement in fabricating a sale. Then I moved to the letters, each one more aggressive than the last, contrasting them with actual county codes that proved the board had exceeded its authority. I could see the judge's expression shift as I presented the trail camera footage. of the realtor attempting to enter my property, as well as logs of vehicles loitering at the gate. I highlighted the contradictions in the bylaws, the selective enforcement against me while other homeowners were left alone. Page by page, the narrative shifted from a non-compliant homeowner to a board engaged in harassment and overreach. The turning point came when I revealed the meeting notes I had been given by the brave neighbor. In those notes were clear discussions of selling off parcels to developers, of repurposing land, and of targeting specific properties that didn't align with their vision. My cabin had not been a random target. It had been a strategic move in a larger plan. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Even the judge paused, eyebrows raised as I read the passages aloud. The purple blazer woman shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her smile faltering for the first time. The attorney attempted to object, but the documents were legitimate, and the damage was done. By the end of my presentation, the weight of the evidence was undeniable. The HOA's claims looked flimsy, even fabricated, while their motives appeared corrupt. The judge announced that a decision would be issued later, but his tone carried a sharp edge when he reminded the board that their authority was not absolute, and that property rights remained protected under state law. I walked out of that courtroom not with a victory in hand, but with momentum. The cracks in the HOA's facade had been exposed, and the community had witnessed it. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now approached me cautiously, some with words of encouragement, others with quiet nods of solidarity. The myth of the board's untouchable power was unraveling, but the battle was far from over. The HOA did not retreat gracefully. Instead, they grew desperate. Within days, I began receiving anonymous threats slipped under my door, notes warning me to drop it or face consequences. My cameras caught hooded figures lurking near the property at night, too far away to identify but close enough to send a message. One morning, I discovered deep scratches along the side of my truck, as though someone had taken a key or blade to the paint. It was harassment, plain and simple. But I documented it all, adding each new incident to the binder. If the board wanted to intimidate me, they had underestimated how stubbornly I clung to evidence. Every act against me became another nail in the coffin of their legitimacy. Meanwhile, the community itself was changing. More neighbors began speaking out, emboldened by what they had seen in court. Stories surfaced of fines levied unfairly, of board members using HOA funds for personal expenses, of selective enforcement designed to punish enemies and reward allies. A quiet rebellion was building, and for the first time, I wasn't fighting alone. Still, the board had resources and connections, and they weren't finished. They began a campaign to discredit me publicly, distributing flyers that painted me as a dangerous radical, someone trying to dismantle the very fabric of the neighborhood. They used community meetings as platforms to spread fear, warning that if I succeeded, the entire HOA system would collapse and the community would descend into chaos. But fear only worked for so long. People had seen the evidence. They had witnessed the courtroom drama, and many were tired of living under the thumb of an organization that seemed more interested in power than in genuine community. As the weeks passed, the battle lines grew clearer. On one side stood the board, clinging desperately to their authority, doubling down on intimidation and propaganda. On the other side stood me, armed with evidence and resolve, now supported by a growing number of neighbors who were ready to push back. The lawsuit remained unresolved, hanging like a storm cloud over everything. But in the meantime, the community was shifting. For the first time in years, people were beginning to question whether the HOA truly had their best interests at heart. I knew the final confrontation was approaching. The board could not tolerate open defiance much longer. They would either succeed in crushing me through legal force, or they would collapse under the weight of their corruption being exposed. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the ridgeline, Dennis stopped by again. His face was tired, his voice heavy with concern. "They're not done with you," he said quietly. "But you're not done with them either." He was right. The fight had become larger than me, larger than my cabin. It was about every homeowner who had ever been bullied into silence, every property seized through manipulation, every ounce of freedom eroded by people who mistook control for leadership. The board thought they could outlast me, but they hadn't yet realized one simple truth. When you strip away intimidation, lies, and greed, all that remains is resilience. And resilience, once awakened, is nearly impossible to kill. The storm was still gathering, and the final battle loomed ahead. The HOA had played nearly all of their cards. What they didn't yet realize was that their next move would be the one that finally broke them. The storm broke faster than I expected. It began with a letter, but this one wasn't from the HOA. It was from the county clerk's office, announcing a formal investigation into the board's activities. Someone, perhaps a neighbor, perhaps an insider, had submitted copies of the meeting notes and financial discrepancies to the authorities. The allegations were serious: misuse of HOA funds, unauthorized dealings with developers, falsified fines. Suddenly, the board was no longer the predator. They were prey. The effect rippled through the community almost immediately. Whispers turned into conversations, conversations into open accusations. Homeowners who had once stayed silent began stepping forward, armed with their own stories and documentation. Years of suppressed resentment flooded out. The fear that had bound people was crumbling, replaced by the realization that the board was vulnerable. At the same time, my legal case finally came to its climax. When the judge delivered his ruling, the verdict was clear. The HOA's fines and foreclosure threats were invalid. Their actions had exceeded the scope of their bylaws, and their attempts to force a sale of my property were unlawful. The case was dismissed, and the board was admonished for harassment. I walked out of that courthouse not just with my cabin secured, but with a sense of vindication that no amount of intimidation could erase. The purple blazer woman had been there, of course, her expression sour and pale, her confidence shattered. For the first time, she looked less like a queen presiding over subjects and more like what she truly was, a bully stripped of her crown. But the true downfall came weeks later, when the investigation into the board's finances became public. News spread that several board members had been siphoning funds for personal use. Vacation trips, home renovations, even car payments. The partnership with developers was exposed as a scheme to enrich themselves at the expense of homeowners. One by one, resignations rolled in, each more humiliating than the last. By the end of the month, the board had effectively collapsed. The woman in purple tried to cling to power, insisting it was all a misunderstanding, that the documents had been taken out of context. But no one believed her anymore. At a hastily called emergency meeting, the homeowners voted to dissolve the existing board entirely and appoint a temporary committee to oversee the transition. Cheers erupted in the community hall that night, the sound of years of frustration finally breaking free. As for me, I became an unlikely symbol. Neighbors who had once avoided me now shook my hand, thanking me for standing when they could not. Some admitted they had believed the rumors at first, that they had thought I was reckless or defiant without reason. But seeing the truth unfold had changed everything. I didn't bask in the attention. For me, the fight had never been about glory. It had been about protecting what was mine, about standing against arrogance and greed. Still, I couldn't deny the satisfaction of watching the once feared HOA crumble, their authority exposed for what it really was, a house of cards. The realtor never returned. The for sale signs vanished. The cars that once lingered at the edge of my driveway no longer appeared. My gate remained locked, my sign still standing proudly. Private property, not for sale. It was no longer just a declaration to the board. It was a reminder of everything that had happened and everything that had been won. Life slowly returned to normal, though normal felt different now. The cabin was once again my sanctuary, the mountains wrapping me in their silence. But the experience had changed me. I no longer saw the community as just neighbors and houses. I saw the quiet power of resistance, the way a single act of defiance could inspire others, the way truth could unravel even the strongest illusion of control. Months later, the county announced criminal charges against several former board members: fraud, embezzlement, abuse of authority. The woman in purple was among them, her downfall complete. The community she had once ruled now spoke her name only in whispers, a cautionary tale of greed and arrogance. As I sat on the porch one evening watching the sunset turn the sky to fire, Dennis joined me. He looked lighter somehow, the weight of years of silence lifted. "You did it," he said simply. I shook my head. "We did it. They pushed too far, and people finally pushed back." He smiled faintly, then raised a glass in quiet salute. To the cabin that wouldn't be sold. We clinked glasses, the sound echoing softly in the mountain air. In the end, the battle had never been just about land or bylaws. It had been about freedom, the freedom to live without being controlled by people who mistook power for leadership. The HOA had tried to strip that freedom away, to sell it to the highest bidder. But they had underestimated the strength of one person's resolve and the way it could ignite a community. My cabin still stands, stronger than ever, its walls weathered but proud. The gate remains locked, not in defiance anymore, but in quiet triumph. And every time I see that homemade sign, I remember the war that was fought and won, not just for me, but for everyone who had ever been told to bow to authority that had no right to rule. The HOA had invited a realtor to tour my cabin as for sale, but I locked the gate, posted my own sign, and in the end, locked them out instead.